Hi, it's Khalil.
We're the Marshals of Truth. All right, so to start out, I think the sixth episode of our series on peace v freedom, I'd like to go ahead and just recap what we talked about in our last one. So, in the last episode or two, we were discussing the ideas of fictional and real societies and real leaders who seek to grab complete peace for their societies or their governments that they create. We looked at Japan and their peace preservation law, and then also discussed the idea of what how you actually achieve like complete peace. And we looked at examples such as 1984 and then other fictional ones, including like Injustice, Avengers, Star Wars, various different ones, and just kind of discuss the real idea of that the only way you achieve real peace is through getting rid of freedom altogether. In some of those, in some examples of how like leaders try to achieve that real peace, they'll use fear and intimidation, um, armed guards, militias going around the towns, and then some of the fictional ones. A great one in Star Wars, of course, is the Death Star, something so powerful to blow up a planet that will make other systems so scared of joining the rebellion that they wouldn't do so. And so leaders will try to get to complete peace through fear. However, it's not complete peace. And so after discussing these ideas of what a true like how you achieve that true peace, we wanted to kind of go towards what is the contrast of that. So we talked about complete peace, but what would happen in a society, in a state, maybe even, if you had complete freedom? We've talked about at the beginning of the series of how humanity began with complete freedom and over time has restricted itself through governments, through order, through law. But what would happen if we went back to that? What if we tried to give ourselves complete freedom, or at least freedom from a state? How would that turn out?
Well, um, we don't have to look into recent history or even look into the future to imagine even what it would be like to reverse authority, because there was a very particular example in the 800s during the early development of the ancient Rus state that Putin today looks back on so much as being the origin of the ethnic connection between Russians and everyone around them, and why Ukrainians are secretly Russian. Um, it was during the time and the development of this state that gave Putin all these ideas. That we have the best example, I think, of the earliest example even of a reversal of organized, the reversal of order in the easiest way of describing it, because um, and we think about the Vikings. We think about the raids on Lindisfarne in England in 793 as being the first Viking attack. We think about the raids on Hamburg in modern day Germany, the siege of Paris, raids on Muslim occupied Cadiz in in Spain. When we think about all those raids in the West, but we don't really think about too much about the East, because the Vikings, they they were fighting each other in Scandinavia until around the same time that the Vikings were going west. They also went east into modern day Russia and Finland. And so the the native peoples of that area, they um, they were um, they were coexisting with each other relatively peacefully. Um, and but they were always like a lot of general conflict. Everyone was really self-sufficient, and so that meant that everyone was relatively struggling to survive. But with the Vikings coming in, they of course were very violent in the way that they came to conquer those areas and exact tribute and take everything from them and go to war constantly. Um, but about 20, 30, 40 years, a certain few decades into their rather despotic reign of the area that we now know today as Russia. The Baltic Rus, as they were known, the native peoples over there, they pushed the Vikings out miraculously around 860 AD. And according to one of the, actually, I think the only historical, the only historical source that we can look at that describes the events of the time um, is from the primary chronicle, or the primary Russian chronicle by Nestor, a monk slash historian in 1113 AD, going to the area and talking to the native peoples and getting a an accurate report of what was happening 2, 3 centuries before he was making this document, and he um, and he wrote in there, quote, "There was no law among them." Oh, and first, this was after they pushed the Vikings out of their land. Quote, they well, and they reverted back into conflict. Quote, "There was no law among them, but tribe rose against tribe. Discord thus ruled among them. They said to themselves, let us seek a prince who may rule over us and judge us according to the law." End quote. And so they noticed that and while I'll be honest, like my own understanding of what was happening before the Vikings came was a bit spotty, and I'll have to look further into this primary source to see if to see what was happening before the Vikings came. But much of the story in the primary chronicle that Nestor wrote is during the Viking era, and around this time, and around like the 800s, and where the Rus state was being developed. So as soon as the native Rus people pushed the Vikings out, again, upon what we see with that quote there, is that there was no law. They needed something to rein in the violent instinct because the tribes were fighting each other, discord ruled, and they needed something to stabilize that situation and bring order. So they went to the Varangian Rus, and that's the name of the Vikings that previously took over the region, um, and the ones that they just actually revolted against. And they said to the people of the Rus, quote, and this is according to Nestor, quote, "Our whole land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to reign and rule over us." End quote.
Yeah. So basically, what you have here is these group of people who had just revolted against a leader and secured, kind of independence and freedom from their own people. Um, they, in their ethnic or family ties or the communities that they make, can be and act however they were chosen, but how that ended up was just constant fighting over resources, um, land, anything. And there's no order to it. It's just it is the groups continuously just fighting and fighting and fighting. And so here you have again the people who had just revolted against a leader to have this complete freedom go all the way basically crawling back to them and asking to be ruled over again because what they really wanted was the order. They wanted that peace. They didn't want to be constantly fighting within each other with the other groups for resources, for other sort of things. They wanted order. And so for them, that meant bringing back their own recent basically overlords all over again because they basically got a touch of what essentially a stateless society would be. Is just groups of people who, to a certain extent, need to fend for themselves. I mean, they may have resources on their own, but when they don't have those resources, what are you supposed to do about it? Negotiations only work so far, and what we had there was just fighting and fighting and fighting. So there they go, crawling back, asking for order from the same people they just rejected.
Right. And that's why I find this moment in history so interesting because, Chad and I, as we were trying to think of examples, to strengthen our point of like, what would, like, is there an example of like of a stateless society, before civilization. I mean, no, is there an example of a stateless society after civilization and after, order came, where the people revolted and there was no order, and then they wanted it back. And we looked, at post World War One and about how so many empires like disestablished, and they collapsed, at the same time, and all the chaos that came from there. But, new governments at that time, they developed so quickly and they created their own sense of order so quickly that we never really got to see what freedom looked like at that time, with very, very few examples. I think this example is the best one because the people got a sense of what freedom looked like, of what total freedom looked like. Because freedom by itself is not bad, but it can't be complete. Just as much as you can't have complete peace, you cannot have complete freedom. And that's what the people got a sense of when they revolted against the Rus, against the Vikings. Um, and that's why they crawled right back up to Scandinavia and asked this Viking named Rurik to take over the state, and to bring order to their society, and stop the tribes from fighting each other so often, and really institute what can be described simply as like a peacekeeping law in society, and it was this Viking Rurik that accepted and was like, I feel like being a king. It'd be cool to have a nice kingdom of my own. And so he was like, yes, thank you, definitely, I will rule over your country and bring order to you. And his children and his children's children would follow the Rurikid dynasty, which ruled over the Rus state, and even once the Rus state had fallen up until the late 1500s, then ruled over the regions around modern day Russia for close to 700 years. And this all came from the idea um, that the people, the Baltic Rus, the native Baltic Rus at the time, were asking themselves, the question they were asking, it's like, what is the point of having no order?
Yeah. It sounds, once again, complete freedom, it always sounds so nice, but it doesn't work. It just doesn't work out because when you have disagreements, they have to be solved, and not everyone's going to be rational about it. Um, the great thing about a state, about a government, a civilization, is that with laws with law and order, you could help settle disputes within people, within groups. You could stop them from fighting each other. There's no overbearing authority that can punish both of them. What's going to stop them besides maybe a few losses on their side or the others? If they really want some resources, they're going to go fight for it. If there's something that's going to stop them from doing that, something that will for sure punish them if they even attempt to do so, i.e., the law, they're not really going to go do it. Um, and so this one kind of shows how a government could, in this aspect, should a government have been there, could have prevented all that internal strife and quarrels that were going on between these different groups of people within, the Ruth people. And that just kind of shows once again what happens with this stateless society is that internally, well, there's not even an internal since there's no state, but no, there's nothing to stop competing groups from fighting each other and just leading to just continuous chaos and violence. Because at the end of the day, it's just the strongest who survives. And that doesn't really add up to a productive state. Um, and so, as I said, that was a great example of how a state could have prevented internal strife in whatever country or so that could have been formed. But another example that I'd like to add was shows what happens if in anarchic society, what happens if there's external strife, an external threat. How are you supposed to deal with that? Um, and so a great example that I had when we were doing our research was the example of the Ukrainian anarchist state that was formed during the Russian Civil War. It was like uh, Makhnovschina. I can't remember how to pronounce it,
All right,
but
I got it. I got
yeah,
it. It's Makhnovschina.
There you go. He gets it. Otherwise, it was commonly known as the Black Army, um, differentiated from the White Army, which was the Tsarist royal like Tsarist forces, and then the Red Army, which was the Bolshevik communist forces in the Civil War. So throughout the story, how the story goes is that the anarchist state, the Black Army, was formed by a man named Nestor Makhno, who is not to be confused for the Nestor, who we just previously mentioned, the historian. But Makhno, he was an advocate for a stateless, anarchist, communist society. So basically, a place in which there is no state. However, the people and the workers and the farmers work together for each other's communal well-being, and they kind of govern themselves and figure out their little deals, however that goes. Um, so yeah, as the story goes, he was imprisoned before the Russian Revolution because he was essentially he participated in a terrorist attack that killed a police officer. And during the Russian Revolution, in 1917, a provisional government that formed after Mikhail Romanov declined the ascendancy to the Tsar after Nicholas II, that provisional government gave amnesty to all political prisoners and exiles, and so Makhno was free. He came back to Ukraine and formed the Black Army essentially, and formed a little state that would be this anarchist society. And internally, there was not too much division. However, it was hard to be reported in history. There's various different accounts, and during this period, there were claims of anti-Jewish pogroms, which is a Russian word for random acts of violence in the state. However, there's disputing reports of it. However, it's held up by some evidence, some goes against it. So it's a claim that's out there. Um, but how the story went, continuing on from that, is that the Black Army, what originally formed to fight an insurrection against the White Army, against the old Tsarist armies, it also fought against the Red Army, against the Bolsheviks, because they, as anarchists, saw the communists as basically upholding the same structure of bureaucracy of the bourgeoisie that they sought to destroy. And so they were basically fighting a two-front war. And as the war went on, Makhno ended up, he needed to make a deal to fight harder against the White Army, who was backed up by Western intervention, including like the United States, Britain. And so Makhno, he had, the leader of the Black Army, had to make a deal with the Red Army, with the man, with Trotsky, who you may have heard of from the Russian Revolution. He had to make a deal with them in order to fight against the White Army. And when it was first announced, there was a lot of division within the state because people saw it as an anarchist society should never be working with the state, you know, the bad guys. And so people saw it as a betrayal of their values. But Makhno and his officers and all that went ahead with the meeting, but at the end of the day, the meeting was a trap. When they got to that meeting, almost all of Makhno's officers were arrested, charged with, you know, insurrection, all that, and then were shot. Makhno himself escaped, fled to another country, and he never really returned. But with that, I mean, that was the end of his movement. The land was eventually taken over, you know, with the Russian Revolution ending and the Civil War ending, just reincorporated into the USSR. But it kind of shows that um, what happens when a stateless society has to deal with external threats, such as other states, other countries, other leaders fighting against them. They themselves couldn't stand up to two of basically the biggest threats in the region of both the White Army and the Red Army. And in the course of that, in order to basically just survive, not only did they have to betray their values as anarchists, but they had they had to again just continue on with the cycle of violence, of war, which is essentially what the opposite of an anarchist, especially an anarchist communist society, seeks to do. What these, what it essentially is, I mean, these anarchist societies seeking to get closer to that absolute freedom that the anarchist desires. There's no state, there's no oppressive government that could clamp down on your freedoms and your rights. And you're supposed to be working with each other, for your mutual benefit. It really relies on the goodness of people. And for one, we already showed how internally that can lead to a lot of chaos and violence. And whenever disagreements happening, chaos and then the battle of wills needs to ensue. But what happens when there's an external threat? When there's another society that's seeking to make sure that their worldview is theirs and is fighting against you? You don't have an organized state to rally up your troops and organize a defense. You have your little militias that may or may not be supported by the people, which is your quote unquote government. You can't really protect yourselves from the people outside, even if you do have that quote unquote peace inside. It just doesn't work.
Right, like the fact that I'm trying to organize my thoughts here, but like the fact that a large and effective army cannot be developed in a society without a state means that that anarchy cannot work, because we're gonna have a lot of evidence to support this point as we go on later, but in a society without a state that can draw up forces that can force people to join the army if they don't need to, or hopefully rely uh, um, upon the consequences of losing said war to get people to join in, for the sake of collective help. The fact that a society without a state is not going to get a large enough and effective enough army joined together means that people don't want to work together. If you get rid of the state, people, if they choose so, will not work together, which means the whole like hope and optimism that comes from anarchy and communism, even like legitimate communism, not just socialism, communism, which is very similar to anarchism in some ways, which is supposed to rely on humans' natural tendency to not fight, which doesn't exist. The like the hope that people, if they got rid of the state, if they reverted back to what life was like 50,000 years ago, that we would not fight each other, that we would go for the collective good. Um, and this is very, very rare in the world. Like there, like it just it does not happen in the same way you'd think it would. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just means that it's not universal. You're not going to create a a society that can last, that is exposed to the rest of the world, that everyone knows about. You know, like that is going to be able to care for each other, care for the collective good, which if it's dealing with external forces that want them to be taken down, is going to be able to adequately defend itself. Even if like a state as large as Russia and as populous as China were to not have a state, if it were to be invaded by even a smaller, way smaller country that had an organized society, that had a strong and effective army with a certain semblance of order, with a little bit of freedom even, they would destroy this super state because they don't have they the super society with billions of people and with huge amounts of land, because they have no order, because people don't naturally want to work together. If there's no state and there's an existential threat, who's to say that people will actually work together to defend? Like there are very rare examples of that happening, but none in a society where there's no order. There needs to be a certain sense of loyalty, and that loyalty often needs to be somewhat forced.
Yeah. It all seems nice to rely that everyone is just going to be nice and generous to each other and work for the group interest. But at the end of the day, the natural inclination of humanity is just to survive. And that means to work in your own self interest, whether that means just protecting yourself or just protecting your family. It doesn't matter all the people around you who you quote unquote should be working for. There's not really a reason to. If you're living fine, you have your food, you have your house, that's it. Like, there's not really an incentive for you to be helping other people unless you were just magically to be born as a very, very great, noble, moral person. It just doesn't really work. And as we said, with an anarchist society, internally it's not going to work because, like I said, there's not really a way to solve disputes without, once again, just violence and chaos and disorder. There's not a way for externally the state to work together with other countries and other nations who do not work or feel the same as them because there's no way to really draw any sort of agreements with that. There's no order. You're just working with a bunch of group of people who may, not even assuredly, they might like think and agree on the same thing. It relies that everyone's on the exact same page all the time and is working for the greatness of everyone else. And if someone steps out of line, it's not going to work because you really need everyone, all hands on deck for something like that to work. And if there isn't, you're just going to fall apart.
Yeah, which really goes to the absurdity of a true anarchy with no state, no leader. Um, because a lack of state means no trade, because just to make this personal for some people, just to really make it, to make it make sense, lack of state means no trade. And no trade means no resources. And no resources, even if it's life and death, means death, mass death. The
Famine.
state,
Yeah,
but the state provides for you in the sense that they may require you to put, a shit ton of work into your regular day, and you might even be miserable with the job that you're in. But the state, if you have the means to pay for certain items, they have them available to you. Without a state, you would not have the capacity of broad resource acquisition.
exactly. If you don't have something, how are you going to go get it? Who's are you going to go negotiate with the other country? Who's going to do that, right? If they don't agree, then what? There's no trade agreements to be made. You don't have a state and no way to really distribute that to everyone without just an absurd amount of just complexity and like if you don't have something, you have to go get it. And once again, that's just going to lead to arguments, to disputes, to conflict, to violence. That's what happened in the Black Army. It was a state that was formed out of violence and it fell to violence. Everything they did was basically to survive because they had no systems or structures that could keep them afloat otherwise. It was literally a fight for survival at all times. And at some point, something's got to give. I mean, you look at a person, you really fight forever. At some point, you're gonna, like, you can't live forever. At some point, you're going to die. Same thing for a state. You fight all the time. There is no peace. There is no order. You're fighting internally. You're fighting externally. You're gonna fall apart because that's all you're doing. Yeah, you like I said, resources. You're not gonna have that. You can't make an agreement. If you don't have it, you gotta go get it. That just means fighting.
Right. And the Ukrainian anarchist state under Nestor Makhno, that was in the late 1910s, close to 1920, over 100 years ago. And since then, the world, time has shown that today's globalized world, it offers the capacity for more resource acquisition, as long as you have the currency to pay for such things, because, that's how a society works. Um, like, there are more things that people rely on, even if they don't notice that they rely on it, that a state helps provide for, that if you were to get rid of that state, you'd get rid of that resource. Like um my brother, he's diabetic. And I know that in a survival situation, if there was no state to help manufacture and help to package that insulin for him that he needs to survive, that he will die. And then like a house, if you if there's no state, then you'd have to build your own house. You'd have to you could not rely on a bunch of people that are being paid, to build that house with permission of the government and zoning and all that, and making sure it doesn't trample on someone else's land or trample on some sort of like geological faulting place or whatever,
Yeah,
like the correct positioning of your house. Like there are a lot of complexities that involve like you buying a house. And if there
yeah.
was no state, you'd have to, yeah.
So like I have my house, but maybe my house that I want to build is on someone else's land. Who's going to figure that out? Do we just have to go fight about it or argue about it? You had to do everything all over again or just rely on the common good that hopefully everyone around you will pull through for you. And once again, like I said, if you have a dispute, who's going to settle it? There's no law. If there's someone does something bad to you, they stole your shovel when you're trying to build your house. What are you going to go do about that? There's no reason that that person couldn't have stolen it. I mean, why not? It's nothing that's going to happen to them. Maybe you'll go over there and beat them up. Maybe not. Who's going to settle that dispute? Is it just going to be the mob? People who just commonly are angry at that other person and give out some sort of punishment? I mean, they might get that wrong, but there's not that common system that could follow through, is predictable, and that someone could, logically assume that if they do this, this punishment will happen to them. That isn't there. It's just kind of assumed. Maybe maybe I'll get jumped on the street, or maybe nothing will happen. I don't know.
Right. There'll be no incentive for doing good things. So in a survival society and where there was limited resources, we would revert to to the sort of pragmatic conflict that comes with that. That's why if Chad and I were in a survival society and there was a limited amount of resources, that one of us would kill the other. It's that simple. Um, price regulation. There's no price regulation that comes from from an organized society, from an anarchist society. And so um, a state might fall, but who's to say that those that might have been organizing some private establishment that has a monopoly on a certain resource you require, they'll make the price
Yeah,
like
the farmer who's
crazy
making
high.
bread, how do you know they're not going to charge me $100 for it?
Right. Because if a state falls, there are certain things in place that still exist, like a private institution that has things you need. A state reins those people in. There's also no education, so don't forget about that. Everything requires a certain amount of collaboration. You cannot you cannot go without that. So if you were to take away a state, there are so many different things that come with that. People that are anarchists, people that are communists today need to really think about that. The state is the most efficient way of gaining material possession. And if you really think you should separate yourself from the material world and that material possession isn't that important, you know what that means, right? That's death. That's death.
Yeah, it's another one of those things that just sounds nice, doesn't work. But basically what you're doing is just reverting our whole species, our whole civilization back all the way the thousands, hundreds of thousands of years to just where we had that absolute freedom, and maybe we maybe because we have our phones we'll be a little nicer. I don't know. It's again just overly hopeful. Basically just reverting back to monkeys, because why not? Um, it as we just come about to their time, it just kind of shows that An anarchist society just doesn't really work. Absolute freedom, it doesn't work because once again, while we may have the possibility to do very, very great things with our freedom, we also have the possibility to do very, very bad things. And if there's nothing to stop us from doing that, besides hopefully someone telling us that it's good, we're just gonna do it. So,
It'd be like the Wild West with no sheriff. But anyway,
basically,
yeah, so we're running really short on time, so we'll catch you in the next episode, part 7 of Peace v Freedom. Until then, we're the Marshals of Truth. We'll see you next time.